And with that, it's my pleasure to kick off our first fireside chat. Kathryn will be joined by our first guest, Julia Boorstin, CNBC senior media and tech reporter and author of Women When Women Lead.
Wonderful. And if we can go to the next slide, I'd love to just get Julia's book up on the screen. You all are about to hear from Julia directly, but I would just like to start with a shout out. Julia's book, When Women Lead, is a phenomenal overview of how we can all work together to increase equity in the workplace. She delves into many of the hurdles that women have to overcome to get to the top in the business world, the leadership qualities that biased minds frown upon despite their successful track record. And in the chat, we're going to be dropping a link to where you can grab a copy of her book. So if you are excited and inspired by the conversation today, as I expect you will be, I've had the pleasure of talking to Julia many times before, and everyone is really in for a treat. So we will share a link in the chat so you can pick up a copy of her book. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. Julia, let's get you up onto the stage. And thank you again, Shayla, as my co-host. Wonderful. Great to see you, Julia.
Great to see you too. Thank you so much for having me. I've always been such a fan of what you've been doing and your work, and I feel like our missions are so very aligned.
I was going to say, likewise, I was really excited when your book came out because, I think that there are so many conversations that have been happening around how we collectively advance equity in the workplace. And in particular, this conversation around gender equity. I wanted to start is sort of a preface to the first question to share a stat that really resonated with me, actually a pair of statistics that I think speak to what we're up against in both the corporate world and the venture capital startup technology world. And those stats are that just 10% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women, and that female CEOs get only 3% of venture capital money. So, you've spent so much time looking at this problem and learning about the inequality of funding, the inequality of opportunity. Start us out. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing right now in terms of the landscape for equity.
I'm really glad you pointed out those stats. I have to say, though, it gets even worse. That 3% stat you mentioned has actually declined to 2% last year and is now less than 2% of venture capital dollars. That 3% stat is actually a main reason I wanted to write my book. I cover media and tech. We all know how powerful the tech world is. We know what it means when a venture capital investor invests millions of dollars. It can supercharge a company's growth. And so often these big bets and investments by the venture capitalists can really determine and define what tech companies influence our lives. I mean, it's like you look at your phone, every one of those apps has been backed by a venture capital investor, or many of them. So I was really struck by that 3%. This idea that this valuable investment was going for the most part to men, and for the most part to white men. And it really was having massive implications on our society. I also, because of my job as a reporter, was interviewing some amazing women who were founding companies and fighting for those venture capital dollars. And I was just struck by a couple things. One, the fact that they seem to be solving different problems, focused on different issues, and really leading those companies in different ways in the traditional stereotype of leadership. And I also kept on coming up against all of this research indicating that 3% number just doesn't make sense. Female-led companies tend to outperform. They tend to have higher profitability. There isn't a comprehensive measure of every startup that's ever existed. And by the way, 90% of all startups fail in their first decade. But study after study indicated that female-led companies tend to outperform, and they tend to yield returns to their investors a year earlier on average. So that 3% number doesn't make sense financially, doesn't make sense rationally. So what I wanted to do in the book is to really showcase those numbers, showing how all of this research indicates that diversity yields better financial performance, and also tell some stories of these women who have defied those crazy odds against them. Because if they can defy those odds, they will surely have leadership lessons and inspiring stories. They'll be relevant, not just for women, but for everyone. And I really wanted to try to introduce some new examples of business success into this media landscape that focuses so much on the rare failures of women and not enough on the success stories.
Yeah, and I love that, and I think the authenticity and the real talk as well with which you've been able to portray a lot of these women's stories is important, because it is really hard. And, as someone who has raised a lot of venture capital over the last 11 years, it can be very difficult, particularly if you're not grounded in the statistics and the experiences of other women, to feel like it's uniquely hard for you because you're just not smart enough, good enough, pitching correctly. I went back and found an old journal of mine from 2012 where I pitched the Muse at an event to almost 500 investors and didn't get a single taker. And my journal was just full of this self-criticism without necessarily realizing that of the other entrepreneurs on stage, almost every single one of them was a man, and that there were potentially elements of gender bias, unintentional or not, in the reception that investors had to what I was pitching. So, when you look at these statistics and the stats surrounding women in leadership, funding to female founders, and they still are so bleak, you've also spoken about remaining hopeful. So what gives you hope?
I am hopeful because there's so much research indicating that diversity in leadership, diversity, whether it's at startups or in teams or at big public companies, it simply yields better results. And I think that you're right to point out the importance of understanding these bleak data points. I am a very optimistic person. I am hopeful in large part because I've been inspired by so many phenomenal women who are working not only to grow profitable businesses, but really working to change the world in different ways. So I'm hopeful because of them, and I'm hopeful because the data indicates that if people are profit motivated, they will invest more in diversity. Yet there are so many terrible, crazy, intimidating, depressing statistics about the double standards that women face. But in researching my book, which started with the stories and then led me to the data and the research, I discovered that I wanted to change my approach to the way I thought about all of these double standards. For most of my career, I thought I should ignore the depressing data about the barriers that women face, because it was better to just ignore it and forge forward. And I know a lot of women who did that. And maybe when you were pitching, you're like, I'm not going to think about the fact that I'm the only woman here. I'm just going to keep on pushing. And I've actually discovered that in many ways, it's incredibly valuable to understand what you're up against, to have the data at your fingertips for a lot of reasons. One of which is that you don't take it so personally. Mm-hmm. And that self-criticism that you put in your journal, I'm sure was in large part because you were like, what have I done wrong?
Absolutely.
And what I have realized in looking at all this research, which I've really been deploying in my day-to-day life since I discovered all of it, is that forget about the serenity prayer and ignoring the things you can't control. I now am all about understanding the things I can't control. So instead of putting on blinders and says, it doesn't matter if I'm the only one in the room, I'm just going to forge forward and say, okay, I am the only woman in the room. How might this impact the way people respond to me? How might this impact the criticism I get? And if I do get criticism that is tinged with bias, how can I separate the bias out from the really valuable feedback? And I think even in biased comments, there might be valuable feedback that you'll be able to use to make your company stronger or your approach to work stronger. And I think that there's something about understanding the double standards that can make them not sting as much personally and not as emotionally hurtful. And therefore you can be more productive because you're like, oh, this is a negative comment. Part of that is about bias, or this guy didn't invest in my company and there was a lot of bias in his comments to me, but there was valuable feedback in there too. And if you could separate one thing from the other, then you could really gain more from the valuable feedback that's part of that. So I do think it's really important to understand the obstacles and not to think of learning about the obstacles as something that's just profoundly depressing and needs to be ignored. So I think I'm optimistic for so many reasons. And I think the more you can understand your challenges, the better equipped you'll be to overcome them. And I really believe that knowledge is power, data is power. And I want to help empower every woman to understand what she's up against so she can be more successful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that. And for what it's worth, I couldn't agree more. I think that, the earlier part of my career, or at least times in my career when I've tried to ignore some of the realities or the research, the result in a lot of cases was that I just took all of it on myself. And as you said, I took it very personally. As I started to be more aware of some of the biases that people hold, some of the realities in funding inequity, like you said, it's two things can be true. You can take feedback and take nuggets and adjust your behavior to try and adjust to the environment you're in. And you can accept that the environment may not be fair. I've always been fascinated by the research that in corporate scenarios, men tend to be promoted based on potential and women tend to be promoted based on performance. They have to do the job before they can get the job. I will say the same thing is certainly true in a lot of funding, where when you see female founders that have raised a lot of money, it's often because they have literally been able to demonstrate in an inconclusive fashion that their product is successful. The Muse had over 1 million users a month before I was able to raise a Series A. I've seen that time and time again. So, I think that I want to ask you a little bit about leadership style, communication style, because I think in your book, one of the sections I loved was you talked about how the classic belief that business leaders are, authoritative, unquestioning male leaders, that view might be on its way out, that view might not actually be entirely true, and that women who might lead with a different style have their own qualities that correlate with great leadership as well. And in fact, you stated in your book that some of the characteristics that women tend to lead with are actually more effective. Can you talk a little bit, for anyone who might not be familiar with this research or this part of your book, what are the types of characteristics that women tend to lead with, and what makes these characteristics more effective?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we're all familiar with the archetype or the stereotype of a leader. And that archetype is of a man. And he's a guy wearing a suit on Wall Street, or he's a guy wearing a hoodie, a younger guy wearing a hoodie in San Francisco. And that's the stereotype. And it's one that we see in the news. It's also one that's perpetuated by the media, and which is and the movie industry, and entertainment industry, which is starting to make progress and being aware of the impact of those stereotypes that they're perpetuating. What I think is so interesting is that there's also this stereotype that leaders are top-down hierarchical leaders who delegate and tell people what to do. And that is the sort of traditional leadership archetype. What I've seen in my research is that there are many ways that women tend to lead, skills and strategies that women are more likely to deploy that are actually incredibly effective in business. So interviewing all these women led me to read 300 academic studies to really understand what it was that these women were doing that was so effective. And there's so much academic research that in many ways was really surprising to me. And I actually think, and as I run through some of these skills and strategies, you'll see why they're more valuable now than ever. I actually believe that the pandemic really shed light on the importance of these more typically female leadership styles. And I think really helped everyone understand why it was so important to lead in different ways, and not just in that traditional hierarchical top-down way. So a couple things that women are more likely to do that makes them more effective leaders. Empathy. Women tend to rate higher when it comes to empathy, which enables them to connect with their teams, to understand even in negotiations what other people might be feeling or thinking. It's a very valuable strategic tool. Another key one is vulnerability. Women are more likely to show vulnerability in their leadership styles and to use that vulnerability strategically, not to say, oh, I don't know anything, but to say, hey, this is what I'm really good at. But here's an area where I don't have strength. Let me invite other people to come work with me, to come collaborate with me, and to use that to invite collaboration. Women are more likely to lead with a communal style, to pull in perspectives from across an organization rather than top-down hierarchical management. They're also more likely to take a divergent approach to problem solving. So a convergent approach would mean rushing to focus in on solving a problem. Divergent approach means pulling on threads, asking about things that might seem tangential, to understand the broader ecosystem around a particular problem. Women also tend to rank higher in terms of adaptability. And it really seems to me in many of my interviews that these two things are connected. If you've already taken the time to understand the landscape, when the situation changes, you're better positioned to make a quick shift because you've done the work. And then in terms of some other things that I would point out are essential, is that women are more likely to found purpose-driven companies, and purpose-driven companies have advantages when it comes to attracting and retaining talent. I've also talked to a lot of entrepreneurs who said when the going gets tough, to know that if you succeed, you're really going to be having a positive impact on the world and helping people. That is an additional ballast, which helps in the toughest of times. There's also research indicating that women have an advantage in fundraising if they have a purpose beyond just generating profits. And then the one that was most surprising to me in all of my research is gratitude. there's a lot of research that shows that practicing gratitude, thinking about things that you're grateful for, enables you to have patience and enables in business situations people to make longer term decisions and have longer term strategic planning. Gratitude is something that women are more likely to practice than men. I was interested to hear, and women enjoy the feeling of gratitude more than men do. I was also surprised to hear that men often associate the feeling of gratitude with owing someone something, so they might be more reluctant to engage in those feelings. This again is totally socialized. There's nothing biological about gratitude. Gratitude is something that women have sort of been socialized to practice more than men have. So it seems like it would be incredibly valuable for everyone to practice gratitude if they want to make sure they're doing long-term thinking and planning in addition to the sort of more day-to-day. But that was one that was incredibly surprising to me, but just shows how some of these things that women have been socialized to do are actually incredibly valuable for everyone. And it would be really valuable, and this is sort of what I'm hoping here, is that everyone can break free from these old archetypes of what leadership looked like and sounded like, and find the leadership styles that are authentic to them and that can have the best value for their company. And we are all leaders in our own ways, whether you're running a company or working as part of a team. So I think those are my key takeaways. And I would just stress, these are not biological advantages that women have. These are things that we've learned over the years, but everyone should be studying and learning them.
Yeah, I love that. And Julia, I couldn't be, I'm extremely passionate about this topic, this idea of what does it mean to be a good leader? And I love the way that you've listed out for us some of those characteristics, because, again, I'll just speak to some of my personal experience. When I first founded the Muse and was building the company, so many people essentially told me I was doing it wrong. I was not aggressive enough as a leader. I had to be more hierarchical, more top down, more hyper direct. And of course, in certain situations, those can be really useful and effective tools and qualities. But I've also long believed that we're actually in a sea change in terms of what types of leadership styles are most effective. And now that the Muse and Fairy Godboss, serve millions of people, millions of women, and frankly, millions of men, we also have a lot of data about what types of leadership styles most individuals are looking to work under or within. And it turns out that when you poll employees, people are looking for empathetic leaders, leaders that recognize their teams, show gratitude, leaders that know how to listen to others and collaborate. We just did a survey on the Muse around toxic behaviors. I believe 62% of American workers said that they had experienced a toxic workplace. And a lot of the behaviors that they specifically called out as being toxic or as contributing to these negative workplace environments were behaviors that you might associate with a very rigid, authoritarian, top-down style. And so I love this, and I think that your work has been a part of this change that we're all working towards. And so for women who are listening today, I would say frankly men and women, but especially women who are looking to grow into leadership positions, there's both the be true to yourself path. There's learn the rules of the game and learn how to play by somebody, by the style that is rewarded. What advice would you give to someone who wants to continue to grow as a leader, as an employee, as an individual, and is trying to understand, how they should do that and how they should think about how they show up?
Well, I think you're absolutely right in terms of understanding the rules of the game. And I think that just like understanding the landscape, understanding your obstacles is step one. But I also think self-knowledge is a really big piece of it. If you're going to be an authentic leader, you need to understand what you're really good at, what you're really bad at, and how you can put yourselves to be better in both of those categories. So I think that's really important. And a lot of times people say like, oh, I don't even want to think about the things that I'm bad at. But this it's important too, because you're never going to be able to make progress if you don't. So I think that I would just say step one is sort of doing a self-assessment. But then I think also charting your goals and your priorities. And those two things can be different. You could say it's really important to me to have an impact. It's really important to me to work in a field that does X, Y, and Z, or it's really important to me to rise through the ranks of my company, but to understand your goals and then also what your path has to be to get there. One thing that I found is very consistent, not just among the female leaders I interviewed for my book, but for everybody, is that leadership is not an end point. You don't become a boss and then you're done learning or leading. The most successful people have a growth mindset, and they are constantly learning and changing, not just about the world, but about how to be better leaders themselves. And I have seen in so many different cases the way that a growth mindset is really this balance between confidence, understanding that you can keep growing and learning, and humility to understand I don't know everything. I need to get better. And I think it's really important to sort of shift the idea away from it's like once you've arrived and you're a boss, you're done. It's more that you're always going to keep learning. You're always going to keep growing and changing. So think of yourself as someone who has some key skills, some key traits, but that everyone's on a path where they're going to keep changing and iterating. And that's where you sort of can shift away from the idea that I'm going to land as a boss and I'm going to have arrived and then I'm done, to I'm on this ongoing journey of learning and growing. And I think that, it's important to think about what your overall goals and priorities are, but then also like, what do you have to do to get there? What do you want to accomplish this year? What do you want to accomplish next year? And it's amazing to hear about how even you wrote about writing in a journal, how even these very simple things of just writing one or two things down can really have an impact in the way you think about holding yourself accountable for those goals. The other thing I would say is very essential, and I apologize for the background noise, is that to have people to hold you accountable on your journey. One reason why there's so much value to having a cohort or a community, such as the community that you're creating, is this idea that if you have other people who know what your goals are, they will remind you that you have to stick to your path, and you can go to them when you need help sticking to your path. And so having a diverse network of people who can hold you accountable and also push you on your own trajectory, I think is really essential.
Yeah, I love that. And funnily enough, the speaker that we have joining us today, immediately after this conversation, is the CEO of a group called The List, which was, for me, the early women's community that really got me through a lot of the kind of hardest early days as a female entrepreneur, because it can feel isolating being one of the onlys in your company or in your field, and having that network of support, of vulnerability, honesty. It's both the mutual cheerleading and the hug when you've messed up or you've gotten rejected. I think that is so incredibly powerful. So I love that. And then, I want to also ask, one of the things that we are thinking a lot about, frankly, today and every day, but with this theme of embracing equity, is it's not just gender equity, right? There are so many important kind of intersectional threads that we need to think about as individuals, as leaders, in terms of building more inclusive teams, inclusive workplaces. And so for you and in your research, what role does diversity and inclusion play in fostering successful women leaders? And how can we create more inclusive workplaces?
I think you're absolutely right. You can't talk about gender without also talking about race. Intersectionality is incredibly important. And if people with one marginalized identity draw additional scrutiny and criticism, people with multiple marginalized identities, so women of color, for instance, draw even greater attention and scrutiny in the workplace, and makes it even harder for them, and they face even more challenges. It is also worth noting that historically, a lot of the workplace sort of systems or groups that were intended to help women ended up helping only white women, and ended up holding back women of color. So I think as companies or as individuals, as you think about supporting women in the workplace, you have to understand that if you don't have an intersectional lens to it, your efforts might end up backfiring. And that's why it's so important for everyone to have intersectionality in mind. I was talking to an investor yesterday. He said, well, we're working on the gender thing first, and then we'll figure out the race thing after that, the intersectional thing after that. I said, you can't do only one at a time. If you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, these things are all interrelated, and you can't be like, oh, I'll get the gender thing worked out. It doesn't work that way. You need to think about taking homogenous culture and making it more diverse, and understanding the financial opportunity that comes from that. One thing that I think has been frustrating for me to see is that there's so much research indicating that diversity is financially advantageous for companies. companies. They will perform better if they have both gender and racial diversity. And that's why there's 40 pages of endnotes in my book to include a lot of that data. But so much of this diversity conversation has become part of this like perks for employees. It's a nice thing that companies are doing, that they're investing in DEI. But guess what? That in many ways diminishes the value of it. So for me, I would love to see the conversation around DEI shift from like, oh, a nice thing to do to the employees, to companies acting in their to their financial advantage. Companies should invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, not because it's the right thing to do. Yes, of course it is, but not because of that. They should be investing in DEI because it's the financially advantageous thing to do for them. And the conversation, I hope, will shift towards talking about the upside potential if companies invest more in DEI.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that, I also think that, and I just echo what you said, like, it is something that we all need to take responsibility for. Just like women can't solve gender equity by themselves without the partnership and participation and like support, even when it's difficult from men. So it's absolutely unfair to put the burden for creating more racially and ethnically diverse companies just on people of color. And I think, by the way, sometimes that's hard. I love that there are a lot of men in the tech space who have publicly pledged not to be part of panels that are all men. I think that, similarly, as we think about just the companies we build, the events we put on, the processes we do, how do we really do our best to make sure that they reflect the full diversity of the people we're looking to reach, the conversation we want to have. So I love that. And I think, we obviously have a very, very long way to go to get society to the place we're talking about. But I am glad that that a lot of people are really invested in the conversation. And I think we've talked a lot about the different challenges. And just to kind of sum up as we get into some of the last questions before I turn it over to the audience. So by the way, please, anyone listening, drop questions in the chat. But in your experience, what are some of the biggest challenges that women face today inside their companies, in leadership roles, and how might we think about addressing or overcoming those?
I think sort of the fundamental challenge underlying a lot of the roadblocks that women face is the fact that they're still in the minority in the workforce. In leadership positions in the workforce. Women actually enter the workforce in the same numbers as men do. Women get graduate degrees and graduate from college in the same numbers as men do, with the sole exception of business school where they're a little bit behind. But the equity in the education space is not the issue. It's really in the leadership positions. Fundamentally, I think it's problematic that women are still not associated with positions of leadership and power. And there's this underlying idea of pattern matching, this idea that when people encounter someone new or a new idea, the human instinct is to fit that person or idea into an existing pattern that they're familiar with. And today, women have not established a pattern of leadership because they haven't had those opportunities. So one thing I'm really trying to do with my book, When Women Lead, is to show the diversity of patterns of success in business and success in leadership, to establish new patterns, to show that you don't have to look like Mark Zuckerberg to be a success in the tech space. And you don't have to have a certain background. By the way, there are plenty of women I write about in the book who did go to Harvard Business School, but there are plenty who didn't graduate college and had found major success in different innovations. So I think it's really about breaking free from these patterns that influence everybody, whether they're giving you a promotion or a raise, and ultimately what I think companies need to do to, again, shift the responsibility back to companies, is companies need to figure out how to use data to overcome that natural bias and pattern matching that people too often fall prey to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's actually a good segue into one of the questions we got, which I think referred to what I was saying before about fundraising. Bethany asked, Kathryn, how have you been able to overcome the realities of securing investment that Julia is accurately describing? And I would say, I think it's a combination of so many things. First of all, wild persistence. I've said this before, but I had to pitch 150 different investors to get my first 2 yeses. I had 148 no's. And that was just the first round. I've probably been rejected by 450 or so unique investors in the history of the Muse. I've also had many people say yes over those years, but it's been a combination of, also trying a lot of different things. You just talked really eloquently about pattern matching. I used to joke that I would almost A/B test my outfit and my demeanor in the early days of fundraising. I'd speak to a few people in t-shirt and jeans. I'd speak to some people in like a nice sheath dress. Eventually, for me, I found that like a black leather, slightly edgy getup was the most effective in a first impression sense of how people took me seriously. But obviously, I'm not saying everyone needs to do that. That was just what I found in a fundraising context. I also realized that when I met an investor in a coffee shop, I often started as a disadvantage, because in a coffee shop, I would say, "Oh, hi, nice to meet you. Do you want a coffee?" Da, 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 da. Whereas if I met someone in an office or on stage, I could project power and authority in the way that they wanted to see it. It wasn't that I was, frankly, any less of a powerful person in other contexts, but it was such a fascinating process trying to look for every little advantage, every little change. And again, also part of it was just finding those people who did believe, who liked my style, and understanding through the support of so many other women entrepreneurs how to overcome. So I see we got one more question. I know we're almost out of time. What are the top 3 questions we should be asking to drive and embrace equity in the workplace? Do you want to, Julia, to give us just one, and then I will wrap up the conversation so we can stay on schedule?
The number one thing that I think everyone needs to be asking of their companies, and managers or founders or entrepreneurs need to be asking of themselves, is how am I using data to make sure that I'm pulling any potential bias out of a situation, whether it's around hiring or promotion or pay. No matter what your instincts are, whether you're a woman, whether you're a man, no matter what your background is, you cannot assume that you don't have bias or don't have some sort of imbalance. I've been so surprised to see how even female managers oftentimes overpay their male employees compared to their female employees. We all need to lean on data, use data as a tool to help remove bias. And that would be the main thing I would advocate for every company and any individual to think about in their day-to-day.
Amazing. Julia, thank you so much. We easily could have gone on for another hour, but we'll keep it on schedule. But for anyone who is listening, who has been fired up and excited by what they've heard, I want to encourage them to purchase a copy of your book, When Women Lead. It is phenomenal. We will drop in the chat a link to the Amazon link for the book. You can also buy it at a local bookstore. And Julia, where should people go if they want to follow your work, learn more about you, and stay in the loop?
Thank you so much, Kathryn. I'm so grateful to get to talk to you and to be part of this important conversation you're having. You can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Julia Boorstin, and I have some great female leadership content on there. I'm also at jboorstin on Twitter. You can also follow me on LinkedIn, and I have a website, juliaboorstin.com, if you want to learn more about the book. And you can take the empathy test on my website.
Yes. Oh, that's a great one too. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Julia. For everyone who's watching, we are going to cut the stream for about 2 minutes, and then we will be back with our next speaker. So we'll see you all again soon. And thanks again, Julia.